All right. Welcome and salam and greetings to all. Welcome to this event. This is brought to you by the IDN, the International Deep Network. The IDN was established in 2023. It's a collection of organizations, activists, researchers, with the main aim of coming together to promote degrowth. And this event specifically is hosted under the Global South Circle. Within the IDN, there are numerous circles being mental and functional. And part of our mission within the IDN is to be a bridge between the degrowth movements and the Global South, and really centering around the question of what is true allyship. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Aya. I'm the coordinator of the Global South Circle within the IDN. I'm an activist. I've been involved in the UNFCCC process, mainly advocating for Indigenous people and youth rights. I'm from Egypt and from Palestine, based nowhere and everywhere. And given just to honor my Palestinian roots, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Palestinian people who have been facing brutal genocide, forced starvation, displacement, and dehumanization. It's been 1 year of brutality, 1 year of our hearts breaking, 1 year of truth and realities being shattered, 1 year and a new land and new people are being targeted. But also, it's been 1 year of solidarity, 1 year of coming together as people. I think it's quite important to contextualize what we are collectively witnessing and to make links. The climate crisis is not separate from the genocide unfolding. And somehow money seems to be scarce for life, for regeneration, but abundant for destruction. We've seen that billions are released for military aid on a whim, yet it takes meetings, years, just to agree on a loss and damage fund. So let's remember that the struggle of justice is intertwined, and may our collective efforts really ignite change for all and bring a life for dignity. So sending our thoughts and prayer at this moment to Lebanon, Palestine, Congo, Sudan, everywhere on this earth. And without further ado, I'd like to pass to my colleague Akshay to introduce himself.
Hello, completely agree with Aya and all solidarity to colonized people struggling and resisting genocide everywhere in the world. Namaste, I'm Akshay. Thank you for joining us here for this very important discussion. Let me just quickly introduce myself. I am Akshay. I'm a campaigner based in India, and all my life I have been part of several campaigns, advocacy, and research initiatives, particularly on inequality, improving public services, and human rights. I am here as a part of Global South Circle at the IDN. Before we start this call, I just have some couple of guidelines for you all. Just keep your mics mute while the guests are talking. We will have ample time for you to provide questions and answers. I am also monitoring the chat section, so please feel free to add questions in your language you are comfortable. I'm happy to use Google Translate, etc., or you can translate for us later as well. So there is already chat box for that. We would like to see some of you and your lovely faces. So please switch on your cameras and show us your bright smiles. In case you have internet and connectivity issues, you can obviously switch off your cameras, and that should help you with better audio and possibly will take less strain on your battery and device. Lastly, this is a safe space and we will not take any kind of violation very lightly. So please respect everyone's space. And yes, let us begin today's topic and why we are even doing it as a degrowth network. We're living on a planet which has been set on fire by the rich and powerful. We can see that everywhere. And we are witnessing also like the next level of mass extinction. And it's not easy for anyone to see this. And particularly in our communities, in our ancestral lands, now even in schools and hospitals, the extinction has entered. Uh, it is also There is also this necessity to keep feeding the capitalist beast and their growth, while rest of the planet is like getting more hungry, more thirsty, more sick. This is why we are here to talk about new approach, which caters and prioritize global majority, to global south at the center. And without the support, solidarity, and leadership from the global south, the degrowth movement itself will defeat its own purpose. Therefore, we are discussing and hosting series of these discussions where we invite people from the global south, leaders from the global south, and discuss how we can help, how degrowth can help in delivering justice, which is social, political, economic, gender, and on all other fronts. And it's a two-way exercise. We want all of us to learn from the speakers, and we also want speakers to tell us how degrowth and other such movements can help their fight for justice. With this, I hand over to Aya to start the program.
So we are very honored and pleased to have with us here Gina Cortés Valderrama. Gina is a Colombian feminist, advocate, and activist committed to climate, gender, and economic justice, with a particular focus on the intersections of decoloniality and degrowth. She currently serves as one of the co-focal points of the UNFCCC Women and Gender constituency, uplifting and strengthening collective and feminist leadership of grassroots activists, indigenous people, and LGBTQ plus people in climate policymaking. She is also a member of the Colombian diaspora collective Aluna Minga, which focuses on culture, migration, extractivism, and peace, where she also co-led the campaign #LifeNotCoal, linking the depredatory and extraterritorial impact of Germany in Colombia. So what a pleasure it is to have you here with us, Gina. I will just set the stage for the discussion here and let you take us through. Just to remind some of you who may have attended our last Beyond Degrowth series, we had Emilia Reyes, and who touched on the importance of degrowthers moving from what she referred to as sourdough activism and really engaging in the hard and necessary process of working to challenge global power structures in the multilateral processes. So, Gina, with your deep involvement in the climate justice movement, you have been at the front lines of the climate negotiations. So we'd like you today to help us understand the dynamics at play, what are some of the key tensions you've witnessed in these negotiations, and how degrowth can play a role in advancing climate justice and addressing the disparities. Thank you, Gina. The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Buen día a todos. And thank you so much, first of all, for the International Degrowth Network for having this series of sessions. And I do feel absolutely honored to be part as well of the series, and also kind of following the lead of sisters that I definitely admired and with whom I also conspire in this feminist world. So thank you so much for that. I will share my screen so that I have a presentation that can navigate us today. And so my train of thoughts is not just going everywhere and nowhere and not confusing folks. And I would also kind of start by connecting from what you just said, or what you said, Aya, at the beginning, and making the connections with as well our current context, a context of genocide, not only in Palestine, but also what we're seeing that is expanding in Lebanon, in different regions, but not only reserved to this region, rather also happening in many other corners, such as in Congo and as well in Azerbaijan and in the Armenia region. And these genocides are fueled by that racism, that addresses those geopolitical and those commercial interests of countries, of economies from the global north, right? Such as the United States, such as Germany, just to name a few. And in the context of that, where those political elites, both from the north and also some from the south, to sustain that hegemonic system of exploitation, of appropriation that continues to annihilate, that continues to drain, the deepest fibers of our existence. And this has been a huge debate as well, particularly in Germany, or in other regions, let's say, in the climate justice movements, in where the connections perhaps of why do climate justice advocates, activists, why do other movements should be caring about Palestine, have not seen and have been as well been neglected, but there is a complete connection of what is happening on the genocides plus the crisis on ecological degradation, economic inequality, and also the violent repression that is profoundly shaping our world today. And I will try as well to make those connections along my speak today, so that we can kind of think about the different ways in which, as collectives, as part of movements, then we can start kind of weaving a more stronger and collective work. And that for that also, I think it is important to start from the point of view, or on what many discussions are happening today when we are talking about different notions of transitions, different imaginaries of where we want to go, different proposals. Degrowth is part of those, and you can see a array of different concepts or imaginaries in the multilateral space, perhaps some frame as just transitions, in other countries as post-extractivism, in the global north as degrowth, and so on and so forth. And what they do, if we start as well kind of seeing right now, is how we are in such a critical moment as well in our history, in which we have different options, let's say two options. Either we continue and we just repeat the same extractive, oppressive, and imperialist modes of production and consumption that so far have reigned our lives, right? But just greening them by electrifying our consumption and by having electric vehicles everywhere, or do we really shift those systems, right? And this global response must just transcend our traditional notions. It needs to really push for a radical shift of those normalized paradigms. And for that to happen is where these discussions have to be happening, or have to be flourishing. Discussions from the degrowth, from the feminist movement, from the climate justice movement, from the debt justice movement, and we need to start making the connections. Of course, we are going to have different agendas, priorities, and so on and so forth, but we need to start really going to the very basic of why are we all actually going to the streets and fighting, right? And when we go through that deeper conversation and through that deeper reflection, then we know where we are starting to build out and shaping a coordinated, a constant, and a very firing social mobilization that unites that network of organization processes and that bring to life those different expressions in the defense of life, and not for continue the profiting the multinationals and the big companies and so on and so forth. So from this is where I would like to start. That is kind of the grounding, and that is as well one of the main purposes of what I'm planning to do today, is not perhaps to resolve and solve all your different questions, but rather to bring more questions and reflections that inspire you to take action in whichever point, angle, profession in which you are. Because in this we need to start a revolution, however, no matter how this sounds. Now, however, I know that, for example, for folks that could be from my region or for my country, when you say revolution, people think like, whoa, my God, what the? But we need a damn revolution. And part of that revolution is going to have so many different roles, so many different colors, so many different ways of coming to life. And there is where we need, for example, the healers. There is where we need the activists. There is where we need the advocates. There is where we need the people as well on the ground. And that is where I continue by connecting the dots on what Aya was saying and what my sister Emilia said in the last session, kind of challenging that baking degrowth conception that is starting to flourish in the north. People can do whatever they want. People can bake the thing. People can really, I do so. I plant my tomatoes, I do my oils, I do my stuff. But our political work cannot just be such an individual and privileged standpoint. If we aim to tackle and to really, really bring down those systems of repression, we need to be serious about the political work that we need to be doing collectively. So lovely, keep on growing your food, that's great, but let's get into a conversation that can allow us to dive deeper, because otherwise then the degrowth movement is just going to be a movement for white northern privileged people, where it's not going to, for example, bring into the conversation refugees, is not going to bring in the conversation migrants. Where are the migrants and the refugees in that baking story? They are not there, right? So if we are serious about it, that we need to start addressing that. And as a way to frame then the conversation, and also because considering that perhaps we are a mix of folks here from different streams, from different backgrounds, from different stances, I will try to, throughout the talk, bring some basic concepts perhaps that some of you might know, but some of you might not know, and then kind of making the linkages on that, on where did growth come, where climate justice come, also from a very from a feminist perspective. And from that, then I would start by the colonial change, a continuous story of unequal exchange. This is something where I always like to, or with what, something that I always like to start talking, and is to bring back the very roots. No, when we're talking about radical actions, we need to go to the roots of that, say, system of oppression. And when we talk about colonialism, then is that we're talking about that racist, that patriarchal capitalist system that is perpetuating exactly those genocides, no? That is kind of, that has served the organizing principle of the global system. And it has colonialism, as it says, that it has imposed, no, colonialism as well has imposed that elitist hierarchy of me on top of somebody, of this other, that means other from a male, white male, cis person, no, that perhaps is different, that perhaps can enjoy rights and what the other deserves or not. And that heterosis normativity has changed our perception and has defined that color palette that goes from the white to the black to my brown, not ranging from white to black to passing, not on how we are going to discriminate, who are going to be putting in the labor division, right? It also has defined the ways that we love, the ways that we relate to our body, no? The ways that we really have as well the freedom to feel others in many different ways, with the desire, but also with the ways of how borders are just kind of dividing us. And it also has not like drawn these imaginary borders with a ruler, no, as a way to exploit our territories, as a way to shape the means and modes of production, as a way to go for the commodification of our bodies, no, where it takes us just from these human beings and put us into these objects of economic design, no? And there we can see examples that go from slavery to oppressive practices, and also for female reproduction. And on all that way, then we see as well how this same colonial capitalist imperialist system have repressed different forms of knowledge, of different ways of seeing the world, of interacting and living in harmony with our ecosystem from a sufficiency point of view, right? It has just kind of extracted and taken out those fundamental rights of the population, and has emphasized on gender inequalities, which have placed women in all the diversity, gender non-conforming folks in a lower status, right? And it has shaped overall our behaviors, our structures, our norms, our conceptions, and that is something that we are going to be seeing as well today. So this prevailing concept and this colonialism doesn't end with colonization, no? It doesn't end with the appropriation of the territories already 500 years ago, for instance, in Latin America, but it continues as that colonial ideology that it starts kind of really flirting with capitalism, and starts flirting with patriarchy, and it starts flirting all with these systems of oppression, and then it starts shaping that concept of development, shaping that concept of progress, through a monocultural notion of domination that has shaped the interactions with our ecosystems and also with each other. Yeah, it goes in line with the thirst for economic growth, the thirst for accumulation based on the exploitation of nature, of our bodies, of our time. And this is something that within the literature, and you can see amazing documentation about this, perhaps from Hickel. I believe that many of you have already read those, but also you can go to a lot of literature that comes from Latin America that I could recommend at the end, and you will start understanding what does that mean in terms of how the geopoliticals are based, no? How rules are also drawn. And then we see something that is called the unequal exchange. And unequal exchange, what does that mean in a very short description? Is that exchange that is happening between countries in which, for example, and I give the example of Latin America, of my country, of large scale mining, which is commercialized mainly for exports. So northern countries come to the territories, with that extractive industry, let's say mining, and this exploitation of that mineral, for instance, requires what? Requires large extensions of land, requires the energy in order to operate those extractive processes, such as transportation, such as the drilling, etc. It also requires, it also takes the raw material, of course, but it also requires huge amounts of time from people within the country that has to put their labor into extracting that activity, right? Sometimes we kind of oversee the notion of time. Sometimes we do oversee what does that mean of labor. And when we put all that into like a bowl, let's say, all these different variables, then we see how all the different multiple possible resources from the country are used for the extraction, the degradation, and the depredation of the territory. For what? For fueling the luxus and the commodity of the north, because it's gone for exports. Instead of what? Instead of using that same energy, land, time, labor, and raw materials for the development and the sovereignty of the country. And it can happen with mining. It can happen, for example, with my country in Colombia. It had happened, for example, with flowers. It can happen, for example, with coffee. It can happen, for example, with sugarcane. It's incredible when you go to the Pacific, where the CBD, where the COP of biodiversity is going to happen, fields of sugarcane. And then is sugarcane trying to be like a part of our culture, and let's be proud of sugarcane, and let's be proud of sugarcane, while all the fields are turned into monocultures for the exports and for the production. And this what creates, it creates that relations of dependency in which the countries that have been colonized, that have these raw materials, are dependent of these exports for the global north, right? And this comes as well part of all the same notion, all the same capitalist regime that has been as well imposed. And this dependency then as well put us into a position of subordination, right? And a position where the global north is still dominating the narrative. And there is where we have this unequal transfer, in the sense of what are we giving to the north, to what we are receiving, in the sense of what we are exchanging. Because what do we have to do? Of course, we have to export a lot of technologies. We have to export a lot of manufactured goods that, if we start looking at the trade rules and agreements, then how fair are these trade rules, right? And what are we consuming actually? Do we want to consume this? These are questions that also kind of encompass the discussion that we have. And that is not only just part of it, because that unequal exchange that we are seeing happens or is built on the greatest persistent historical subsidy. And that historical subsidy is the unpaid, the exploited, and the precarious domestic and care work that has been done by women, particularly those racialized, peasant, and indigenous and impoverished women from the global south. Because that domestic and care work is what allows other forms of work. Everyone, every single being in our lives has gone through a phase of care, either from the birth, either from at home, even when we're old. Look at the COVID pandemic, right? There we have a good example. And who have been the ones that have been responsive? women in all the diversity have been the ones that have been put it in the forefront. And it's something that is not measured, it's something that is not valued, it's something that is not spoken, and it's something that is also not integrated in many of the degrowth reflections and analysis. Because we can think about this first part that I put it up, which is an equal exchange. And you have everyone speaking on that and saying, like, yes, and for the transitions, like, yeah. And on the basis of who? How is that going really to change? It is not only about changing the energy matrix for another energy matrix. Who is still going to be fueling that energy matrix that you're going to change? How is that system still going to change? If we do not understand that capitalism has been built on that, right? And then as well, it's not only about reorganizing these, it's about redistributing these. It's about shifting as well that. And when we go deeper to that feminist structural analysis, then we are really able to kind of zoom back and respond in a more complete and comprehensive manner. And with that story, within that story of an equal exchange that I have paved now, then we start thinking and seeing, okay, what has happened as well in the climate space, what has happened as well throughout this story of extractions. And what we see is that according to the production gap report in 2023, there are many trajectories, there are many national plans, that countries then put to say, okay, this is how we're going to tackle climate change, or this is what we need for the energy transition, this is yeah. And this production gap report, what they did, it looked all the trajectories, all the global plans, and it stated that according to those projections, all what it leads to is that we will be needing 460 more coal, 83% more gas, and 29% more oil. And that is 2023, a report that was in 2023. And that is just one part. But if we see as well another inform that has been presented by the World Bank in 2020, where it also makes a similar kind of assessment, but in another direction, it states that by 2050, the demand for critical minerals for the so-called energy transition will be an increase of 500%. And what are critical minerals? Well, critical minerals are all those minerals that are needed, for example, such as graphite, lithium, cobalt, and that are needed for electricity storage or conduction. And these 500% that I'm saying there are only for these electricity storage and conduction, but are not really kind of encompassing the whole infrastructure that is also needed, right? And if we see those figures, then what are those figures going to be leading to? To more of that unequal exchange, right? By the north, right? And when we see as well, then we put, in one hand, we put these destructive patterns where we are leading to, and then we start looking as well on the emissions, for example. We see on how the global north is responsible for 92% of the world excess of carbon dioxide emissions, right? Even though these materials are taken from the south, it is basically mainly in the north where it is used. And it doesn't matter that if it is the energy transition. I mean, if we start seeing, and I put again the case of Colombia, if we see what is happening is that on the one hand, Germany is making, has after the attacks from Russia through Ukraine, then there was some sanctions, and then they called Colombia and said, like, hey, can you please give us a little bit more of the coal? Then one of the biggest mine was reopened. And what they did was like, okay, they have the coal from there. And at the same time, in parallel, they have been building some bilateral agreements for the exports of hydrogen from Colombia to Germany, of course. So this is how things have been shaping. It is just jumping from one pattern to another one. And this is where we need to be vigilant. This is where we need to be putting the loop and the zoom on that. And what happens, because all of these many different resources are going to be imported again from countries that have large deposits and that reside in the continents of Africa and in the continents of Latin America. Yeah, this overexploitation really overexplodes as well not only labor, but is also putting at very big risk the human rights. And something that is also important to say here, and that is also very linked to genocides, and it's also very linked to the situation that we are experiencing right now, and to the context as well, where the COP is going to happen, is that all this conception of extractivism as well have been are based on imperial geopolitics that expand on ideas based on the empty space. And what is that idea of the empty space? And here you can read, for example, Maristela Svampa. It's a very great scholar from Latin America, I think it's Argentina, where kind of brings out a little bit more on what this idea of the empty space. And what the idea of the empty space is that it justifies territorial expansion in rural areas, perhaps with small populations, but often with great ecosystems, with great, like sources of natural resources. And then it's like, okay, right, well, this is a territory, people is not living there, we can do our project, correct? And what happens? That often this narrative of empty space just disregard the spiritual significance that is for communities, disregard indigenous communities that live there. And what we are seeing as well is how, in the name of energy transition, we are seeing the occupation of territories used as a tool, right? By dehumanizing the communities that live in the territories, by taking, like, they are no humans. Again, this colonial of the other, who deserves the rights, who is supporting that? That's an empty space. That is a corridor for energy. That is a green corridor zone, green energy zone. And if you look for green energy zone specifically, you will see some info that perhaps I cannot say now, but you will see what also this occupation is happening, like that there is no party. It opens the possibility and the alliances between elites, between governments, and this is how it is continuing expanding, and we see it already happening. And what happens with that expansion is that we then see the racial sacrifice zones. And what are racial sacrifice zones? Well, racial sacrifice zones, and if I'm speaking too fast, please, people tell me, racial sacrifice zones are defined or have been defined by the special rapporteurs of the UN, different special rapporteurs. And what are special rapporteurs? Special rapporteurs are independent folks that are, let's say, kind of following a specific thematic. So you have a special rapporteur on poverty, you have a special rapporteur on gender-based violence, on the right to a safe, clean, and healthy environment, and so on and so forth. And they do consultations, they engage with communities, they go to the territories, and they start shaping this abundance of knowledge, of experiences, of data, of facts. And they, after some years, then the special rapporteur on forms of xenophobia, racism, and discrimination has then kind of clarified as well and put it very clear what racial sacrifice zones are. And these are areas or regions where environmental degradation has made these territories so dangerous that it's not more possible to be inhabited. And what has happened is that usually these territories are inhabited by marginalized folks due to reasons of race, ethnicity, or national origin. We can also see racial sacrifice zones even happening in the global north, for example, in the US, where we have neighborhoods where Black BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are living, and where you put the industries, you put the wastewater, you put the chemistries, and people live around, right? And this is what we're seeing. You can link that as well happening with Palestine. You can see it as well happening in Congo. You can see it happening in many different regions. As well, something that is very linked and is very interconnected with the geopolitics that we are living right now is that according to the World Bank, and of course the World Bank being, is not the most radical and gets a little bit conservative perhaps on the figures, but some of the reports that they mention in 2021 is that climate change could force internal displacement of 216 million people across 6 regions, and that is internal displacement. We need to think about as well about what is going to happen internationally, where people from the south is going to start migrating for the north, and we are seeing that happening. And what is happening in the borders right now, what is happening in the migration right now. This is why everything is interconnected. This is why everything matters. This is why we need to be more, go to the depth of these issues, right? And at the same time, in those areas where this unequal exchange, these racial sacrifice zones are happening, we have seen as well the threats and the murder of environmental and social leaders. Nearly 2,000 land and environmental defenders were killed between 2012 and 2022. And the figures that we are seeing right now, the cases that have been registered in 2023, we see, for example, how Colombia has been the most dangerous and murderous country in the world for environmental leaders. And if we see the list, just the top 5 of those countries, we see how they are all in the global south. And we see how they are as well in Latin America. We see where they are located in the regions such as the Amazonas, regions, for example, that are rich in terms of forest, in terms of lithium, in terms of coal, So we see as well how everything gets interconnected. And there is when we start kind of diving into the climate justice part, When we see and when we recognize how everything, what we have said until now, is very interconnected, then we see, and it's in Spanish, sorry, but that should be climate justice. Then we see the emergence of climate justice, by understanding as well how those territories and communities that suffer the greatest impacts of climate change, of imperialism, have contributed the least to that degradation. Right. And at the same time, how these countries that are experiencing that are really experiencing that permanent and irreversible losses and damages to their livelihoods, damages to their territories, islands that are being flooded and are disappearing. And when islands start disappearing with that, it comes the disappearance of language, the disappearance of traditions, the disappearance of so much cultural richness that we have, the biodiversity. And that is something that cannot be quantified in monetary terms. That is something that is lost. But still then the climate justice movement, because climate justice is not only a concept, it is really a movement that comes with a very strong intersectional lens. And by intersectional lens is understanding how all the different connections and layers of oppression intersect, where we see race, gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, class, right? And not just to prioritize the rights of one group over another, but to understand that they are intersected on the same oppression, right? We see as well climate justice by challenging and reframing economic and political structures, and as well as kind of proposing national, regional, and local actions and strategies and roadmaps. And it also makes a call for collective rights and for international solidarity, kind of understanding how our fights and our struggles in this same burning and boiling pot are interconnected, and that we need international solidarity if we want to get out of this. And something that is as well at the heart of climate justice is the call for reparations. And the call for reparations here is something very important, is something that is as well kind of, how you say, a blind spot. I don't know if that is correctly said, but it's like a gap. It's a gap from the degrowth movement. Reparations is not something that needs to be a call from the global south. Come on. I mean, folks in the south are in the front lines. Folks in the south are being murdered. Folks in the south are really putting their bodies. They're so resisting every single day. They are calling for reparations. The global north needs to be calling for reparations at their own empire, at their own governments, at their own centers of powers. It cannot be solely the responsibility of the south, because those that have as well the power are the ones as well that are in the belly of imperialism, in the European Union, in the US and Canada, in these regions, they need to be calling that. And when calling for reparations, we are calling for the restitution of that damage, for the restoration, for the compensation, that it's even in economic terms, but all in all, for the guarantees of non-repetition. That is very important. And that is important for the degrowth community, that is important for the climate justice community. Because if we guarantee that there is no repetition of those destructive and murderous models that have shaped our love and our consumption models, then we can be assured that we're moving towards another society, that we are moving towards other type of well-being, that we are moving towards equity in other corners, right? So this call for reparations is something that needs to be looked, outside that inward-looking perspective from the degrowth community, from those localized actions that are beautiful and that are artistic and are loving, but it needs to expand as well the perspectives on that. And this is also something that perhaps then says, okay, which could be a starting point for those calls. Let's look at the Green Deal. What is the Green Deal moving? What is the European Green Deal saying? What is the US Green Deal saying? It is truly proposing models to transform the roots of the crisis, or is simple just, once again, the electrification and the consumption for the comfort of the North? We are electrifying all vehicles by 2050. I don't know what. We are just flooding our cities with these scooters and this. Like, is that truly all what the North has to propose? Let's be critical about that as well. And of course, this to say that there is no climate justice without human rights, without gender, and without economic justice at all. So here is where, and I have been already kind of prompting this, where this is where degrowth in the North and as communities start coming as well to shape it. We have seen as well, we have understood as well what the climate justice movement has been pushing for, what the realities in the territories are, what activists are well pushing for. And from a feminist approach, then we need to start talking about the redistribution of power, not only the organization of labor, but also the redistribution of power, asking ourselves, okay, what is the life that we want to live? And that's something that the degrowth movement does very well, like what life is that the ones that we want to live, what do we want to consume, to produce, at what cost, right? Something that the degrowth movement does very well is to make a clear call or proposition for that urgent reduction in the intensity of material and energy consumption from the global North, reducing and proposing very clearly how we need to take out unnecessary forms of production, such as, for example, fossil fuels, jets, fast fashion, advertisement, challenging that consumption, challenging those notions, those individual infrastructures, let's say, and thinking about the radical reorganization of our society, economies, and political arenas, the decommodification of our social provisioning. I think that the degrowth movement as well can contribute a lot to the climate justice, with more deeper analysis in terms of class, with more deeper analysis that comes as well from trade unions, that comes from labor, kind of making these conversations about initiatives such as the cap and share in terms of the resource use, like pushing back that capitalist growth drivings and making proposals and starting that conversation, a conversation in which it is not about innovating with other mechanisms in which we are going to bring the people in a rotten system, but how we are really shifting towards other ways, other imaginations. And with that, then as well, and apologies because I used a presentation that I had in Spanish and translate, so for another session, so you might see in Spanish, but it's good, you can practice. So as well, something that really good that brings, or that something's very strong from the degrowth movement that also will contribute, and we really need to be pushing for that. That is also part of some of us folks that are in the climate space, and how we bring that as well into our narratives, our advocacy work, is to make the connections with the planetary boundaries. no? Kind of bringing those images here where we see the planetary boundaries, what are planetary boundaries, those limits, no? That can, for example, sustain life in this planet, where we not only talk about climate, but we also need to talk about the integrity of the biosphere. We need to think about the changes in water, the biochemic fluxes, and so on and so forth. Climate is only one of the 9, no? And when opening this, no, this perspective, we are opening that perspective as well from what has been called the tunnel vision, like the carbon tunnel vision, or the CO2 tunnel vision, I think is the name in English. What does that mean? That means that our policies and efforts at the climate space have been like, let's reduce emissions, let's reduce emissions, let's reduce emissions, like, wait, like, open it. And that is what we need to do. And that is something that where I see that the climate justice movement is already not like really more like, hey, this is not only emissions, no, and there is where we see that happen after the Kyoto Protocol, which I will come in a moment, but also expanding that, right? And that is something that we will come as well as part of it. So then let's move as well to climate finance, which is also part of, I think that perhaps many folks are also interested in this part. And before I go through the different details of climate finance and what is going to happen at COP, I would like just to quickly kind of provide some context for folks that perhaps are not so in the loop of this abstract, crazy world that is called the UNFCCC. And what is the UNFCCC? So the UNFCCC stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This type of multilateral space love abbreviations, love complicated names, love things that doesn't make sense, but you need to navigate that. And once you navigate that, then it's okay. But be patient with me if I oversee one abbreviation, and do call me out if I do an abbreviation, because I don't like when people do that. So the UNFCCC was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Convention. That was like a big conference, a big moment where people now was thinking about like, yes, the limits of growth, and others were like, yes, we are making this world inhabitable, blah, blah. People got together. And the UNFCCC Rio Convention is part of 3 different conventions that happened at that year, or that emerged that year. And you have the UNFCCC for climate change, you have the one for biodiversity, also known as CBD, which, by the way, this year is also happening in Cali in like 2 weeks. And you have as well the Convention on Desertification, the CCD. The UNFCCC is kind of the older one, the biodiversity is a little bit younger, and the one on desertification is a kind of the youngest sibling of the different conventions. This year actually is an interesting year because we are having the 3 conventions happening this year. The UNFCCC, or the Convention for Climate Change, happens every year. The CBD happens every 2 years. And the desertification, I really have no idea, but I think it's like also not every year. But this year we're having the 3 of them, just like a fact. And what was the aim of the UNFCCC? Well, the aim of the UNFCCC was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that represent dangerous human interference with the climate system. So we see, no, this carbon tunnel vision, right? What happens? This was ratified, or was endorsed, was accepted, by 198 countries, also known as parties in the space, which ratified the convention. That means that countries say like, hey, yeah, I think that's a good deal. Let's get into that, and let's open a conversation to have a dialogue. This dialogue and these conversations that happen in this space are not happening in a democratic way, in the which that is not that it's per voters, but it's on consensus, which makes things tricky. But also, I think it's important to note that there is no, no country has more power than the other one, because that is something that you could see, for example, in international institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF, where you see US, Japan, France having like more voting power. This is not happening here. One country, one vote, one voice. And Each year, then, in order to have all these conversations, then you see the Conference of the Parties, also known as COP, which is the that decision-making organ that meets every year. For the convention, then in the 97, then we have the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol was really focused kind of more on emissions. That's why, and I'm making this really long story in a very short story, but then the Paris Agreement came and said like, hey, this is not only about emissions, and we need to recognize that climate change is a threat that implies many other social aspects and economic aspects. So we need to expand that conversation. Then we said, okay, Kyoto Protocol, thank you so much. We continue with the Paris Agreement. And then in 2015, people ratified it, countries. And then under the convention, there is something that is very important, and I think is important for this conversation, and is one of the recognized and declared principles. And that is the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Let me have a sip. And what is that? That means that we are in a crisis. No, we are in our house. And it's like everyone here has a responsibility to do, no? Like a common responsibility. We need to all do something, kind of, right? In our countries, Colombia needs to do some efforts, countries. But it's different. It's different. It's not the same responsibility from Germany, from US, from Canada, from Japan, from Australia. It's different responsibilities, and there are different capabilities, because there was a story of colonialism and imperialism that just plunder our territories, and we don't have the same capabilities. So that's how this principle is framing, in the terms of the convention of the multilateral space that call for climate justice. Calling for historical responsibilities for that ecological depth, for the appropriation of the commons, for the exploitation of the atmospheric space. So that is the way in which this principle serves as well at the forefront for communities, for civil society to advocate towards more just systems. Okay, that's a lot of the UNFCCC. So then climate finance. Climate finance then is it doesn't have really a definition, or there's no consensus on the definition, let's say, on climate finance, not only on what it entails, but because when you start defining a concept, then you start thinking about like, oh, and which are the sources, where the money comes from, where blah, blah, blah. And that's where parties, countries start getting into the conversation like, oh, wait a minute. No, wait a minute. I like this. I like not this. And that's a constant conversation that is still happening, conversation that happen in many other different bodies. And what is climate finance? So financial resources that are needed to be mobilized for mitigation and also for adaptation. And this can be local, national, transnational, and that can come from the public, from private, and from different alternative funding sources that we can speak about that in a moment. And in 2009, then in the COP15 in Copenhagen, the so-called developed countries, and I'm using just these terms here for the sake of using the same terms that are used in the documents, but not as legitimizing the terms. The so-called developed countries then committed to mobilize 100 billion per year by 2020, That say like, okay, the world is on fire, we need to put some money there for climate action. There was this commitment. However, this commitment was not accomplished. The country really could only kind of raise 80 billion, and it was only for a matter of some years. So this is something, and as well, this 100 billion target was something kind of, let's say, not out of the blue, but it was not really informed by science. It was not informed by needs assessment. It was not informed, on what people or countries truly need. Then in 2015, seeing how things were, then they said, okay, countries decided to deliver and to start a new collective quantified goal, NCQG, just putting those terms so that people get oriented in the COP's conversations. But what is that? Was like a new goal, something that is going to replace the 100 billion. And that decision on what is going to replace that 100 billion is going to happen at COP29. where countries are going to say, okay, we learn from the past, we learn from what is happening, now we need to change that amount. No, we need to start thinking about what countries are needing and start putting that in the table. And then we see as well conversations happening in terms of loss and damage, and conversations happening in other conversations. What happens as well, and that are some reflections by checking many of the different institutions, by checking as well different of the sources, and I think that just to provide as well a little bit of that glimpse of how colonialism is still painting, no, our institutions and agreements and so on, is that there is still, or climate finance is still follows that colonial imperialist narrative, no, in which is a discourse of beneficence, of generosity, where we see such as terms such as donors, no, because countries are donors, no, they provide aid to those vulnerable, not vulnerabilized, not marginalized, right? They also keep on working on this narrative of developing versus developed countries, that it was very much instaurated in the 49 in the US by Truman, no, kind of dividing those in developed and developing, and those that need that aid and those that not. We also see then how concepts such as innovation and resilience are being instrumentalized in the same context. I mean, I love the word resilience when we think about the kind of original term referring to our ecosystem, to nature, and so on. But it is a start to being used as well towards communities and peoples in a manner that I personally truly challenge. Because what they are doing is to say, you know, Palestinian people, you need to be resilient. You need to be resilient. Be resilient for the next time, so that when it comes, you are better prepared for the next bombardment. That is resilience for communities. It's just crazy. It's like telling a woman, you know, be resilient when your partner punches you in the face. Don't cry next time. Just be more resilient. And it's like, whoa, no. So that's a very beautiful narrative that the global north is imposing, and is saying, like, we need to build resilience of communities. We need to build resilience of communities. Why don't you just get responsible of what you're doing and stop plundering the South, instead of putting the responsibility on the communities to be more resilient? It's just nuts. I mean, it's just crazy. And the fact is that still civil society, some civil society folks repeat this, because the details, you know, like the devil is in the details. It's you need as well to kind of start as well deconstructing all those narratives through that colonial, imperial, anti-imperialist lenses. So I lost my train. So yeah, so then as well, no, it is framed as this generosity. And we see, for example, and I tried to extract some parts here from the Green Climate Fund, when you see, like, thanks to the generosity of the contributing countries, like, wow, the generosity, right? Thank you so much, no, thank you. And you also see as well, not that, for example, they frame climate change, and this is something that we see happening not only in terms of that truly business capitalist sense, but also in military terms, where we see climate change offers businesses an unprecedented chance to capitalize on new growth and investment opportunities, right? We see as well how this narrative, because of what? Because then we see, okay, where are we going to put the money? And we're going to come on that when we see where the money is actually going. And I think I need to speed it up a little bit. So we see as well the World Bank appearing once again. Just briefly to mention and to bring the devil here, the World Bank, among other multilateral development banks, is being part of the functional framework of the Climate Finance Fund in a different way, either because they are kind of the ones that are providing the finance, either because the governments, they're like the channel, they have any administrative function, and so on and so forth. So, for example, we see now the loss and damage fund being allocated within, no, the World Bank, and they play then this role. They have then this role, and because of this role, then they are able to influence that. no, by influence where the money is going and so on. And it is important just quickly here to note for everyone that the World Bank has been an institution that was created in the after a period of war, right, which was led by the Global North, and which was then as well constituted while many countries, particularly as well in Africa, were still colonized, right? And in this system, then there is some more voting power for countries such as the US. Something that is also particularly is that in the last year, then the World Bank brought a new gender strategy, and this gender strategy tries to bring aspects on care, on social protections towards poverty reduction. But what they actually are doing is just a kind of bringing women into that rotten system. And here I put it a quote from many feminists that also we keep on repeating, is that feminists, women do not want to be mainstream into a polluted stream. Rather, we want that stream to be clean. What does that mean? Just don't put us into that rotten system that is limiting and is exacerbating the different forms of oppression. Let's just really shift that system. How is climate finance distributed? Well, it's distributed in 2021, according to some studies, 60% of mitigation. So here is where it comes the business opportunity of climate change, where we see why, because mitigation is something that you can get some revenue through the construction, the development of renewable energies, infrastructures, right? While on adaptation, it's not that you can get like that return of investment, or however you call it, in the same way. What happens as well, mitigation is something that is required mainly by countries in the global north, in the minority of the world, and adaptation is something that is hugely needed in countries from the south. No, this is our priorities. Is not perhaps that mitigation, but we need to start adapting. And you see then how these dynamics of north-south get into the conversation of finance, where the money is going, where technology is going. And you can see as well by energy being one of the most funded sectors there. What happens as well is that also some studies have mentioned that according to the different national plans, the needs now of countries for 2030 is around 5.8 to 5.9 trillion that are needed. So if we see and remember the figure of the 100 billion, that's peanuts compared to the need now of 5.8 to 6 trillion millions that are needed. And what is important to say as well about the climate finance landscape is that 94%, approximately 95% of the existing climate finance is in the form of return seeking. No, what does that mean? That it is through an investment that goes either through debt or equity, where the funder, where the donor is expecting some financial return. So the story just gets more crazy. It's like, you are plundering us, you're exploiting us, you're just violating all different rights. And at the same time, what the responses are more debt. That is truly not responding to any sort of justice approach. And we see as well that in that conversation, the global north push for more private, while the global south countries push for more public and direct funding. And what we see, something that I think is reflected perhaps from that degrowth perspective, is that narrative of scarcity. It's so repeated here in the climate finance. There is no money, there is no funding, scarcity. There are no resources, scarcity. What degrowth also allow us and kind of knocks our brain and help us to see in a different ways is that we live a world of abundance. We live a damn world of abundance. Let's be clear on that, of abundance, of resources, of nature, of money, because the money is there. The money is there, but we need to move out from that conception and that notion of a scarcity, because the resources are there. We have what we need to live, right? And that is also where feminists are very strong, pushing for that radical redistribution of power, of resources that we are going to see in the different demands. And with that, then I move to the final part, which is a little bit more on those demands that civil society, different movements have been pushing for, particularly for this COP29 that is going to happen in Azerbaijan, where the climate finance aspect is going to be very critical. Different coalitions, different movements from environmental NGOs, trade unions, indigenous people, women and gender, younger youth have come together in a campaign that is called the Pay Up campaign. And this Pay Up campaign has been something that has been an effort that has been started since the last year, but also coming this year, where we are starting to work into those alliances, right? Kind of looking as well within our own movement and say, like, we need to come into conversation and we need to be stronger in our asks. And how that happens through the defying and kind of challenging this debt nature, no, because the climate finance being allocated as a form of debt undermines completely this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, because what it's doing is repeating that same story, no, in which the responsibility goes to countries for the global south. Also, what happens as well with debt, and that is something where we have been, and we need to be as well recognize the vast and amazing work that our comrades from the debt justice movement have been doing, no, or bringing the attention on that, and feminists, particularly from the economic justice movement, saying, okay, actually, if we start looking a little bit more deeper, what happens with those debt cycles is that at the end of the day, it is, guess what? Once again, women in all the diversity, the shock absorbers of international debts. And why is that? Because through debt, what countries do is like scarcity, debt, we don't have money, austerity measures. Austerity measures is like, let's put less money, no, to education. There's no money for culture, close culture. There's no money for sports. There's no money for health. There's no money for education. We need to, no, like, the household. And then women start kind of being absorbing and kind of being taking that shock from the debts, shock from the reduction of that fiscal space. So that is what the conversation of debt is so crucial in whichever space that we're talking. And that is also what it is so crucial that the degrowth community as well make the interlinkages with debt justice, with the cancellation of the illegitimate debt. Yeah. Making those lines very, very clear in our conversations. Perhaps I still need to read more. Perhaps it's not there. I'm not sure, but happy to read that perhaps in the comments. But that is something that I have not really seen so much happening, and it's the relation, and it's how the degrowth is moving and kind of diving deeper into trade agreements, right? Into debt justice, what is happening there, because all of this as well is so bonded with the trade agreement. But I personally have not seen a lot of literature on that. So if folks here have seen on that, I would truly appreciate them to give some light. And if not, then we need to produce that, right? So these disproportionately affect women and gender diverse people, particularly those that are living those intersectional realities. I explained that on the buffer. And of course, this does not only affect the public budgets, but also the household budgets. Finally, let's follow the money, because there is no money. There is no money, but there are some figures here just to bring some attention. And I am focusing only on military spending here, because that is very clear, because that is very much needed, and because I do want to as well do a big shout out to the feminists that have been working on demilitarization for decades. Feminists that have been doing and following this work for so many years, that is starting to resonate. Gladly, finally is starting to resonate, and that I want to bring as well that into the radar and the attention of the degrowth community. It is shocking that some estimates said that in the first 2 months of US-Israel's bombardment to Gaza, that was the equivalent of 75 coal-fired power plants operating for a year, just 2 months. As well, that some estimates say that those pledges And what means that? So that money that countries committed to provide for the loss and damage fund at COP28 last year represented 2.5 hours of military spending. Nothing. That's nothing. And the global military total expenditure from last year was 2.4 trillion US dollars. 2.4 trillion US dollars. If the military were putting in the same spectrum of countries, they would be the fourth largest emitter if they were a country, the military. These figures are just crazy. And we are still accepting that. Well, not all, because we're advocating against that. But this is something that we need as well to put in the radar. There is where we need truly to bring the attention also of the climate justice movement. So when people say, what does the climate justice has to do with Palestine? What does it has to do with Congo? What does it has to do with Azerbaijan? What does it has to do with arms and conflict? The response is there. No, societies cannot thrive in the middle of a genocide. Societies can just not thrive when they're experiencing ethnic cleansing. Societies cannot thrive when that money is given for murder and not for transitioning towards collective well-being. And that is just impossible. It's just impossible. So we need to shift that, and we need to be very clear. And that is something where feminists within the climate space and the multilateral space are being very vocal, and will be as well very vocal during the next conversations and negotiations. This is a great document. I promise that I will pass different resources at the end. This is the report from Oil Change that was released in September of this year. And you can see what they have done. Oh, because I missed to say, but the campaign that I was explaining at the beginning, the campaign of the Pay Up campaign, what we did as well, and what the country, like civil society did, was like go through the different reports, research that has been done. So in this research, for example, it was also put at them paper from Hickel and Fanning, where they said like, okay, in terms of what is owed to the global south from the 60, I think is, it is around 192 trillions. This is the amount of money that was put it. Then we saw, okay, what is happening in the climate policy report. Many different reports were put it, and were compared, and the civil society said, okay, let's do like a very, let's say, conservative figure, push for 5 trillion per year that countries should be agreeing at COP29, that should be agreeing this as a kind of more as a way to put more pressure. But from that 5 trillion, what the huge demand is that 1 trillion should be given in the form of grants, in the form of direct access. And that to say then that it is possible. It is not something that just comes like really out of imagination, but if we just see the different sources that can come to finance that, we see how it is needed to divestment and the funding, right? It kind of summarizes everything, going from fossil fuel subsidies to really funding climate action, form changing and putting as well the wealth tax, tax on big technology, arms and luxury companies, divesting from military spending, and so on and so forth. If you see the report there, you can see as well of the different sources where this comes from. I will not expand on that in the spirit of just moving towards the end. Some of the demands of the civil society are just put up here, but basically what it is most important to highlight is that civil society is demanding climate finance that comes not from the private, like not giving more power to the private, to corporate power, but really something that comes from countries, not shifting the responsibility and the power to the corporates, as well, that this funding is additional, is not part of the already existing funding that goes to development work, that as well This funding comes through different democratic, transparent, and accountable mechanisms, through those structures that have been put in place for perpetuating the hegemony of the North. And by this, there are many different calls, there are many different discussions that go outside the climate space when calling for the transformation of the Bretton Woods institutions, for the international financial mechanisms, and as well the World Bank. Calling, of course, that we recognize the climate debt as part of a larger historical and continuing ecological debt that has been accumulated, and that this call perhaps for 5 trillion, 1 trillion is just the starting point, but it doesn't mean that that covers the whole ecological debt. Of course, as well, that this finance is coming directly to marginalized communities, with a strong approach on human rights, intersectionality, gender equality, as well, that we change what we fund and how we fund, and overall really rethinking the system and the way in which we can make tangible that call for reparations, and to reshape as well within our movements the discourse on climate finance towards one that is questioning the climate debt of the global North. And I think with that, I stop because I have mega exceeded the time. Apologies for that, folks. But I hope it has been helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm really taking a lot from the discussion, but what I really want to highlight here is the money which we are asking from these governments is not their money. It's basically what they looted and for these many period, and now we are just asking for our own money, and eventually how everything is just always one struggle, as the presentation shows, and as we were discussing, it's always one common struggle which is spread across multiple movements and struggle. And maybe with that we can take one question, Aya.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to ask one question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for discussion and Q&A. So going back to what we're collectively witnessing, we're seeing the fall of the post-World War II international order, which was driven by the global North and the false stories of human rights. So we've seen as well with the genocides and the violations and the ICC warrants. People, do you think people from the global South should trust bodies like the UNFCCC or the UN Security Council or the World Bank with their future? Or are we trusting the wolves to guard the sheep?
So there are different things, and I think that we need to separate them. The World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, are institutions that I personally believe that cannot be reformed. They need to be abolished. They need to be supplanted. They need to be put on fire, eroded, and to the trash. That's what I think about those institutions. And I think that that is as well a common feeling among civil society. And that's why many of us have been really calling and making these connections in the different spaces, not only in the economic justice and finance for development conversations, but also coming into the tax justice discussions, coming into the climate justice conversations, and so on and so forth. And that is why you will see, for example, a huge advocacy work coming from different angles, for example, to have the Convention of Tax Justice within the UN. Have, for example, as well a process that talks about debt justice within the UN. Why the UN? And then I separate here. So the UN perhaps, yes, currently are not, let's say, responding, to the needs, let's say, and to the urgency of what we are experiencing now. This is something that is true. This is something that needs to be changed. But I do believe that is not something that is like what is coming next, because what we need to be pushing for is for that multilateral system to be reconstructed. not just reform, but that to be reconstructed by bringing back those principles from the charter, but expanding as well that notion, and by really giving power to the South. So the conversation here, I think that is not only on that institution of the UN, but also what, and allow me then to link it with the work that we do here, is not just the institution, but is how the global South has to do a lot of collective work, to get into those alliances, to shape that power from the South, and to say, yeah, you Global North, hey, you World Bank, well, it's not anymore like that. It's not anymore like that. We are pushing back your rhetoric. You are pushing back your power. We are, and this is something that the Global South must do. And if you see as well the conversations that are happening around the new international order, and you see as well that being published recently by, how is it, Progressive International, you can see as well the discussions happening around this, about what is actually needed for that democratic multilateralism, and what is also needed for those institutions to be institutions that are actually moving towards that sovereignty of Southern nations, right? In which we are shifting where the voice and the power is, because that power exists, but that power needs to be consolidated into more stronger blocks. And I did not mention that, but these type of processes in the space are conformed by different groups of regions. So you have, for example, the G77, or the African group. You have ILAC, which is the Latin American group, where you see all the countries from the regions coming together and deciding as well as regions. And that's where the advocacy work with civil society comes into conversation. That is where the role as well of civil society comes to the space. I think that what happens within those spaces is so abstract, so limited seen as well from outside, and it's perhaps just seen. And it's truly also happening that the UN is extremely being romanticized, and so put it into everyone wants to be now everything on the UN, and it's also and also civil society sometimes. And I'm speaking now not on my role as co-focal point or whatsoever. I'm speaking just on my personal role, but it's as well kind of fueling that policy tourism. It's like you are going there for policy tourism, that you want to be at COP, and why you want to be at COP, why you want to be there, just to push your individual organizational agenda. Don't erode the work that civil society has been doing for decades, because civil society stay in those negotiation rooms until 4 a.m. pushing backs and holding the line for human rights. That's work that you don't see, right? And that work comes as well along with having those conversations with those governments, having conversations with, for example, representatives from Colombia, and using those opportunities in the moment where they are. So, for example, now we are on fire, kind of coming and getting into conversations with Colombia while we have the government that we have, right? And what that does mean in terms of how countries are pushing back the blockade from US, how countries are pushing back the blockade from EU, from the European Union. And that is like, okay, what is civil society? And that is a constant conversation. And that is also where the degrowth movement comes into, okay, what are the proposals, and how do sufficiency policies look like, and how do they are being reflected into these international conversations? Yeah, because it's not only about having degrowth. I don't care if it's degrowth, beyond growth, sufficiency, or whatsoever. What we need is the substance to be reflected in that conversations, right? And this is how then it comes with sharing knowledge, sharing experience, having that dialogue. And I believe, to be honest as well, that as part of that conversation, as part of that collective call for liberation, we have so many different angles, so many different roles to fight, and so many places where we need to be putting the fight. And I must say as well that I have been drained. Sometimes I feel like, what the fuck are we doing here when these fuckers are able to just be speaking in front of everyone? But then you recall as well, what are you doing there when you start connecting and coming back to your movement, coming back to the collective power, coming back to that fire, to speaking through to power. When you speak and when you engage as well with different governments, when you as well kind of really tell things as they are and not just shutting down anymore. So this is, and I don't say that is just and with that I don't want to re-romanticize what happens there, but I want just to make the clarity that it's another front for that collective ask towards another society, because it is a space where folks have that one voice, one vote, where we can have those discussions. How difficult is for us within the Degrowth community to get an agreement of what this or this and this is. Now, how we can do it in the sense of governments, how then we could think about sovereignty for Africa, how we can think sovereignty of Latin America without having conversations on what we want. And if we are calling out, for example, for the abolishment of the World Bank, what are we proposing? How are we proposing? How are we seeing as well our regions? What technologies do we want to have? And who has what, so we can push those relationships? And that only works with the absolutely work, guidance, and fire from the social movements. So social movements are critical on that. And social movements also have to, so it's not that now we need to be engaging in every single corner. It's that how we are getting into that conversation and how we are following as well the guidance, the power, and we are sharing the space as well in these conversations. I think I did not respond to your question.
No, you did. You did. If anything, you reinvigorated my spark and reminded me of why we even go to these COPs to begin with. So we're quite above time. I know we have some people here left. We can possibly, actually, do we have any like burning questions in the chat, or if someone has, maybe we can make.
Yeah, Julian had a question. Julian, are you still here?
Julian?
I cannot.
Yes, Julian is here.
Mm-hmm.
I am still here. Yeah, if there's time, I'm happy to answer this.
Yeah.
Also, hi, Gina. It's good to be with you. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm like half working and half listening, but it's pretty awesome to reconnect. The question that I put into the chat, which you can see and look at as well, is I'm coming from a US context, and I did the Degrowth Masters with Gina, and yeah, I think it's interesting. Like degrowth, it's starting to gain more traction in the US, but I think mostly it's a term that it's hard to get very far with. And so I'm currently working on donut economics and kind of have this like idea of, using donut economics as an entry point to think about like, okay, maybe actually to stay within social and planetary boundaries, it may involve degrowth, or strategies that move us in that direction, like decommodifying various things. There's evidence that would maybe lead to some degrowth, and so not leading with that, at least in the US. So curious to hear your thoughts in terms of the donut framework, and how that actually could help us think about this sort of global or international alliance with movements, in the global South, and then eventually, move us maybe in the direction of degrowth, but maybe not explicitly start with that as the term.
Thanks for that, Julian, and also really happy to see you again or hear you again. I'm not a super expert follower of donut economics. I think that mainly because part of the work or the connections that I try to do with social movements is for a deeper kind of anti-imperialist call, let's say. I'm not pretty sure of how the donut economic, for example, is really diving into those more deeper conversations that go to what we were explaining at the beginning on those colonial relationships. I do see as well how these interlinkages, of course, with planetary boundaries and putting it provides the more visual, no, as well, that more visual and perhaps more clarity for folks to start navigating these terms. But perhaps that is part of my not knowledge on diving deeper in the donut economics, but I see that something deeper in the analysis is still needed, but that's my quick, short answer. But happy to engage in a conversation on that after the event.
Totally. No worries. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for your patience in terms of time. The recording is going to be super heavy.
All right. I think just because of time, Gina left her details, so I'll let Akshay close us with some closing remarks, and we can, take it forward.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Gina. A lot of times the UNFCCC and the climate negotiations are really not meant accessible to, especially people like me. Like, I am not trained into all this. I work as a communications person, so one of the very few people I've come across who actually can make even people like me understand this. So thank you for that. Taking back a lot from this discussion, as I said, but I really like your emphasis that degrowth should work with the social movements to build power from bottoms up, and that's the message I'm going to take for other fellow degrowthers. Over to you, Aya.
Yeah, and reach out to like movements, reach out to. So I didn't expect a lot of that, but there are these constituencies from where I come, but other movements do engage with them, do have as well a read on the different reports, documentation, initiatives, campaign. Like let's keep on building that collective power that is so much needed, rooted in that international solidarity. Like really deeply into that anti-colonial solidarity that is so much needed, not only for the system, but also for our own bodies and souls, towards that resistance and resistance, as I like to call it. So opening the space for questions afterwards, and share my email. I will share the list with some perhaps valuable reports from the bunch of facts that perhaps I have thrown, but I know that
Did anyone else
lose?
Gina? Yeah, it seems like it. Well, I don't know how to follow from that. Truly, it's been a wonderful talk. I feel so inspired. And I thank you all for joining us. And I will be sharing an email with the recording and with the readings that Gina will share with us. And do stay tuned. We are continuing this series. It's going to be a monthly discussion. So stay tuned for our next conversation in November. And if you want to know what the Global South Working Group Circle is up to, please join us at degrowth.net. I'll share all the details, and I wish you all a beautiful evening. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Is Gina back?
Thank you.
Gina.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Gina.
Just fuck off. No, it's too much.
The internet's like,
Bye.
yeah, but
And I use a presentation, but I go really into the train of thought. So yeah,
no, but really it was so rich and
Yeah.
enriching that we just let it be. We didn't want to cut you off, and you, if anything, you touched upon all the other questions that we had in mind.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Thank you so much for the space and for the platform. I think it also for me, it's really nice to be speaking to not the climate folks, because you get into this jargon and repetition and you're like, how many times I'm telling this to the same people, but it's also lovely to see like new faces, and it was beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good evening, folks.
You
Thanks
too.
for the work.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mhm, mhm. Boom.